is a great pleasure to welcome all of you here for our 30th annual celebration of the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The address this afternoon by Dr. Marc Lamont Hill is the culmination of a whole series of exciting events that we have been having here at the university to celebrate this week. I want to begin by acknowledging all of you, those of you who are here, Senior Vice President Dr. Ruth Watkins, community leaders, administrators, faculty, staff, and yes, most important, students. And welcome to those of you in the back who are high school students. We're glad to have you here on the University of Utah campus. I want to begin by thanking the people who have been responsible for our celebration this year. Ed Munez, Director of Ethnic Studies, Carla Mota, Needham Chan, and Mindy Johnston, and a whole bunch of other people I know have contributed whose names I don't know. So thanks to all of you for everything you've done to make this celebration so wonderful this year. This is one of the longest running and most comprehensive events in the state honoring this iconic civil rights leader who was the catalyst for change and who continues to inspire us today. On August 28th, just as our fall semester was beginning here at the university, the bells rang out across the state, across the nation, and really the world. The toll of the bells commemorated the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. Actually, I'm old enough that I can remember that. And that was an amazing day when he was standing on the steps giving that speech. This year, tens of thousands of people gathered as he stood where he stood on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. And together as a nation, we once again remembered the powerful words. We paused to reflect on the progress that we've made since that time and the important work that we still have to do since Dr. King proclaimed, "Let freedom ring." His actions were peaceful, but his message was powerful, and it awakened others to speak out and encouraged dramatic changes that gave Americans who had been silent a voice and raised the consciousness of all of us. 50 years later, we continue to celebrate his courage, his passion, and his vision. The university is deeply committed to the values championed by Dr. King. One of my favorite quotes from Dr. King is this: "The function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character. That is the true goal of education." At the University of Utah, we are proud of our legacy and our efforts to enhance the success of our diverse faculty, staff, and students, with the broader goal of enriching the educational experiences and success for everyone, all of the students who come to the U to seek the manifestation of their own individual dreams. It is our goal to continue working with the community in a united effort to ensure equality and opportunity for everyone. We are particularly grateful today to welcome Professor Marc Lamont Hill to our campus. Now, I had the pleasure of spending last evening with Marc, and you are in for a real treat today. He is indeed a distinguished scholar of hip-hop culture, but he's also a warm and very engaging human being, and I guarantee you're going to like him. So thank you again for joining us. We're glad that you're all here today. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Octavio Villalpando, Associate Vice President for Equity and Diversity here at the University of Utah. Octavio?
Thank you, President Pershing, and I too want to offer a special welcome to our new Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, Dr. Ruth Watkins, and I'd like to ask her to please stand because it's important for our community to make an association with a person, and I know she is here. There she is. Thank you, Dr. Watkins, for joining us. We are all assured and confident that Dr. Watkins will continue the same legacy that President Pershing established here at the University of Utah around equity and diversity, and look forward to lots of continuing successes under your leadership, Dr. Watkins. It's also my pleasure to welcome you all to our 30th annual celebration of Dr. King's legacy and contributions around civil rights. It's important to recognize, I think, where we are today and where we were when Dr. King was alive in leading this important social change for our country. One of the areas that Dr. King would speak a lot about was our youth and the importance of making sure that our youth in this country understood how to continue to create change to benefit every member of our communities. In that light, what the committee, the Martin Luther King Jr. Committee here at the U, decided to do this year was to focus our events on youth. And gives me a special sense of accomplishment when we have a keynote speaker of the background that Dr. Hill brings to the University of Utah. In keeping with the focus on youth, I also want to recognize the young people who are here today. There are a number of high schools that have joined us and sent students down to our keynote lecture, as well as recipients of this year's Dr. Martin Luther King Youth Leadership Awards, which were made possible, again, by the University of Utah Alumni Association. I know many of you are here. We're going to provide a special recognition for your accomplishments, but if we can take just 30 seconds to have you stand along with your families and have the audience recognize your accomplishments. These are students from throughout the state of Utah, and Dr. Bell helped bring all this together. Welcome, and congratulations. Thank you, and welcome to the University of Utah. We are very, very excited to welcome Dr. Hill today. He is a leading hip-hop intellectual in the country. Maybe he's an artist as well. Dr. Hill is trained as an anthropologist of education, and he holds a PhD with distinction from the University of Pennsylvania. He's currently a member of the faculty at Teachers College at Columbia University, and also holds an appointment with the Institute for Research in African American Studies. His research focuses on the intersections between culture, politics, and education, and he's particularly interested in locating the various sites of possibility for political resistance, for identity, and for knowledge production of formal schooling contexts. Very apropos when we talk about hip-hop and schooling contexts in our societies. Dr. Hill is the author of 2 books entitled Beats, Rhymes, and Classroom Life, Hip-Hop Pedagogy and the Politics of Identity. And the second book is The Classroom and the Cell, Conversations on Black Life in America. He has also co-edited 3 books, Media Learning and Sites of Possibility, Schooling Hip-Hop, New Directions in Hip-Hop-Based Education, and The Anthropology of Education Reader. Dr. Hill is an award-winning writer and a columnist and editor-at-large for the Philadelphia Daily News, and is a former host of the nationally syndicated television program, Our World with Black Enterprise, and has been a political contributor to Fox News Channel, where he was also a regular guest on The O'Reilly Factor. And if anybody ever had the opportunity to watch him and Mr. O'Reilly on television, you, I'm sure, got quite a kick out of how lively that conversation was. He continues to lecture widely and provides regular commentary for media outlets like National Public Radio, The Washington Post, Essence Magazine, and the New York Times, and is currently the host of HuffPost Live and BET News, as well as a regular contributor to CNN News. Dr. Hill is a founding member of My Fifth, which is a nonprofit organization devoted to educating youth about their legal rights and responsibilities. Again, those of you who had the opportunity to join us earlier this week in welcoming Trayvon Martin's mother understands the importance of the work that this foundation is helping us accomplish in our country. In 2001, he started a literacy project that uses hip-hop culture to increase and teach school engagement and reading skills among high school students, and continues to organize and teach adult literacy courses for high school dropouts in Philadelphia and Camden. He's clearly an accomplished and very busy professor, and in 2011, Ebony magazine named him one of America's 100 most influential black leaders. Finally, in his spare time, he sleeps. So it is quite a pleasure for me to welcome Dr. Lamont Hill to the University of Utah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thank you all for coming out at noon in Utah to help honor the life and legacy and memory of the great Martin Luther King Jr., someone in my estimation who is the greatest American ever produced. I had the opportunity to spend some time with the president of this university yesterday and to meet his brain trust, those young people, those ambassadors who are here to advise and to do great work here as students. And I really got a sense of what this community is about. Can we turn the lights up just a little bit? I actually want to see your faces. Just a little bit. A little bit. And it's exciting, actually, to see a campus that is committed to honoring the legacy of Martin King for more than a week. You all had Sabrina Fulton here last Thursday, a wonderful, wonderful woman who in many ways embodies the struggle and the sacrifice and the commitment that all of us must make in order to imagine a world that is much brighter, much broader, much better than the one Dr. King left. But the fact that that work is happening here in the campus for a week and even longer in terms of the planning and the organizing and the sacrifices that people had to make is a testimony to what's possible when a community of people, irrespective of race, class, gender, creed, decide that they want to make the world better. And they see the campus as a site for that kind of investigation, that type of activism, that type of intellectual project. You all should be applauded for the work that you do here. Not every campus does this. I travel the country quite a bit. And this is one of the few spaces that I've seen that have really tried to honor the life of Dr. King by making the word flesh, as it were, to not just talk about King's legacy, but to live it through service, through scholarship, through leadership. So I thank you all for giving me the opportunity to do that today. The exciting thing to me about talking about Dr. King is, of course, he's an easy subject to discuss. He's wonderful, he's brilliant. He is, in many ways, the patron saint of civil rights activism, not just for the country, but for the world. But he becomes doubly exciting to discuss in this moment. 2014, we're here discussing Martin Luther King. And so, as we think about Dr. King's legacy, it has to happen against the backdrop of 2014. The moment that we're in right now. Because if we don't set Dr. King's legacy against the backdrop of 2014, if we don't situate it within the political and social and cultural realities of the moment, we run the risk of doing something that Dr. King would never want us to do, and that is simply blindly celebrate him. That is to simply honor him as an extraordinary human being, to reduce him to some sort of civil rights action figure who came and marched and died. Instead, the legacy of Dr. King says that we must challenge ourselves to do more. We must challenge ourselves to reimagine him and reimagine the world in such a way that we produce greater outcomes. That, for me, is what makes this week so special. It's not a day of simple commemoration. It's a day of critical reflection, critical engagement, and in the spirit of Dr. King, mass action. Mass action. So, to do that mass action, we have to understand 2014. On the one hand, we have to understand that 2014 serves as a signpost of what is possible in the American democratic experiment. It is a signpost that America, in fact, has the ability to do wonderful things. We can't talk about Dr. King without talking about the age of Obama. The fact that 2 times, not once but twice, a nation elected Barack Obama as its president. Now, whether you voted for him or you didn't, and we're in Utah, so plenty of folk didn't. The fact that he stood there as the victor on November 4th, 2008, and once again on November 6th, 2012, suggests certain types of possibility, because when you think about Barack Obama, 2008, you're talking about just 100 plus years beyond an Emancipation Proclamation. You're talking about just 100 short years beyond a Plessy versus Ferguson that suggests that the nation can be separate but still equal. We're just a few decades beyond freedom rides where people's physical bodies were placed as a ransom for justice. We're just a few decades beyond a moment where segregated lunch counters were the prevailing idea and barking dogs and water hoses were sprayed upon people. People's very bodies were thrown in the way and the purpose of democracy. We're just 43 years beyond the Voting Rights Act of 1965 when Barack Obama is elected. Think about that. 43 years after the right to vote is certified and averred by the state, 43 years after black folk get full citizenship and the full spoils of democratic participation, the moment 43 years ago that black folk become Americans for real, one of our own babies becomes the leader of the most powerful empire in human history. That suggests the possibilities of democracy. That suggests the possibility of human growth and expansion. It means that we might live in a country that doesn't just grow old, but also grows up. And that feels good, right? It has to, come on. It has to feel good to know what is possible. It has to feel good to know what we can do. It has to feel good to look at this great democratic project that we have erected. It must feel good to go into the mall of D.C. in January of 2009 and again in January of 2013 and say, look what we did. To stand there and watch this man and this family and these children enter and re-enter the White House, all of us standing there with our best clothes on, smiling and laughing, even if you didn't vote for them. It's like a wedding, right? You know, you get your best clothes on, you dress up, you say nice things, you whisper about the couple when you get back in the car later. Everyone is on their best behavior because we are literally stunned at what is possible. We arrive at the mall for this wedding of democracy, this beautiful ceremony that shows us our potential. But we can't stop there. We can't become too self-satisfied. We can't simply pat ourselves in our collective democratic backs. No, we must move forward to the day after. The day after the ceremony, the day after the wedding, and do the work of repairing and healing and building and growing. Everybody's good at weddings. Not too many people are good at marriage. It's the marriage Dr. King wants us to deal with. It's the marriage Dr. King wants his legacy to speak to, the marriage of democracy. So when I sit here and have the opportunity to think and talk about King, I'm thinking, what can we do? What lessons does his legacy offer us such that we can keep this thing moving? I think the first lesson that Dr. King's legacy offers us is the lesson of deep listening. We live in a country that is obsessed with talking. There ain't no shortage of talking in this country. 24-hour cable news, blog, everybody got a blog. Students have Facebook, YouTube channels, Instagram pictures, Instagram accounts. They're taking selfies, photographs of their food. There's a kind of obsession with the self and a kind of obsession with articulating one's own voice and vision in the world, and there's something extraordinary about the ability to do that, but we can never confuse competing conversations and multiple articulations of one's voice and vision as a conversation. Because if I'm talking and you talking and I'm talking and you waiting for me to finish talking so you can say what you were going to say anyway, that's not a conversation. You can turn on, I spent the last 4 years on Fox News on the visiting team. And I've seen the conversation. I'm now on CNN. I see the conversation, MSNBC. I hear the conversation. It's multiple people talking, but nobody really listening. Charismatic speaking is easy. Charismatic listening requires a different level of commitment. And so when we look at the legacy of Dr. King, that's what we find. A commitment, a moral, ethical, and political commitment to charismatic listening. Dr. King's last birthday, he spends in January of 1968. He wakes up and he comes down the steps quite early. He gets dressed. He puts on his jeans. He puts on a windbreaker jacket. Has breakfast with his children. He goes immediately to Dexter Street Baptist Church. They have a small cake for him. They sing happy birthday to him, and then he begins the work. He meets with Chicano activists, trying to figure out how they can expand and thicken the freedom struggle, so that we don't constantly imagine civil rights, and we should not imagine civil rights as like a black thing. Some of the most extraordinary legatees and beneficiaries of civil rights have been white men and white women and disabled folk and gay and lesbian brothers and sisters and Latino brothers and sisters. He wanted to expand and thicken the freedom struggle, so we never imagined it purely as a black thing. He listened. He met with anti-war activists, figuring out how we could stop this thing in Vietnam. He listened. He met with civil rights activists, trying to figure out how they could build on the gains of 64 and 65, wanted to plot out a new civil rights agenda. He listened. He met with Chicago sanitation workers. One had just been mauled, trying to figure out how they could get safe work environment, how they could get living wages, how they could create a new economic agenda for everyday people. He listened. Now, Dr. King listened because he understood the political value of listening. He understood that those agendas mattered. He listened because he knew that those could be potential allies. Too often in this world, we are divided by our politics in such a way that if LGBT rights are your thing and somehow that's not, it's not connected to your beliefs about the environment, or you're an environmental justice advocate but you don't really care about voting rights, or you're trying to do education reform but the person over there is really interested in housing, because we may not agree on all of those things, we submit to a kind of ideological purity that says, if I don't agree with everything you believe, then I ain't got to listen to you. And if I ain't got to listen to you, then I ain't got to work with you. And if I ain't got to work with you, then I'm going to stay in my silo over here while you stay in your silo over there. And in the meanwhile, we're having a firing squad in a circle while the political opposition is unified and organized, even if they think each other's crazy. So this becomes part of the work of Dr. King, is to force each other to listen deeply so that we're not just locked at the arms singing "We Shall Overcome," but also locked at the circumstance. Because to understand what it means to be locked at the circumstance is to understand that America responds differently to political coalitions than it does to political individualism. Now, some of that, hold up, don't even clap, I want you to hear this. Some of this is about strength in numbers. Some of this is about the power of the masses. We need that. But if we're going to really talk today, let's talk, because I'm here to unsettle you too. This is also about the fact that America responds differently to white suffering. America responds differently to male suffering. America responds differently to straight heterosexual suffering. So part of what Dr. King understood, because remember, Dr. King ain't just a Negro preacher, he's also the greatest political strategist perhaps of his generation. He understood the difference. When John F. Kennedy walks through Harlem in 1960, he holds up a black baby. His belly's bloated, snot's coming out of his nose. It's dismissed as a campaign stunt. Those Northerners, you know how those Northerners are, going through Harlem, trying to get some cheap black votes, trying to make Adam Clayton Powell happy. Similar to when Bill Clinton walks through the Arsenio Hall show playing the saxophone. Or Hillary Clinton pops up in Selma in church trying to clap on beat. She almost had it too. Almost. It was dismissed as a kind of campaign stunt. Juxtapose that within your collective imaginations to 1963 when Bobby Kennedy walks through Appalachia. He's in West Virginia. He holds up that baby whose belly is also bloated. Snot's coming down his nose too. He's crying as well. We begin our war on poverty. Now, Dr. King's collective vision was one where we wouldn't concede to that reality. We don't want to live in a world where a baby in Birmingham or a baby in Boston or a baby in Berlin or a baby in Botswana are worth different amounts. We don't want that kind of world. But Dr. King understood that we could garner a different kind of sympathy, that America's misery index is different for different folks, and everybody's not imagined as equally vulnerable. So he understood listening as a kind of moral and ethical, but also pragmatic political project. We got to listen, but not just to different people in different generations. He also understood the value of listening to young people. This week's commemoration is about young people. It's about the power and possibility of young people. Some of y'all kids out there think of Dr. King as an old man. Dr. King, when he died on April 4th, 1968, was only 39 years old. And trust me, 39 years old is not very old. The older you get, the less old 39 will seem to you. But Dr. King dies on April 4th, 1968. He's 39 years old. When Malcolm X gets cut down in the Audubon Ballroom in New York, February 21st, 1965, he is 39 years old. Che Guevara dies in Revolutionary Struggle, October 25th, 1967. He's only 39 years old. Dr. King, before he died, was organizing in Birmingham and Selma in his 20s, graduated Morehouse College in his teens. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense right here to our west, organized by Bobby Seale and Huey Newton in their teens and 20s. Fred Hampton Jr. cut down on December 4th, 1969. In his own bed, a child. Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, Rosa Parks, all of them were young people at the moment that they were engaged in the most important and dangerously unselfish acts of democratic participation ever imagined in American life. Young people have always led the way. Ain't no revolution's been led by old people, y'all. So the challenge for us as a generation of people is to not be the ones who knocked our mothers and fathers off the stage and won't let our sons and daughters on. But too often we have organizations, institutions, political seats in this country that are often held by people who would rather have the institution go up in flames or have the building fall with their arms around it than to give it to a young person who has a new vision, who has a new voice, who has a new purpose, who has a new understanding. We must listen to young people. Because remember, Dr. King was sitting in an elementary class like the one that's in the back of this room right now. He was in 5th grade at some point in his life. You think Dr. King's 5th grade teacher knew she had Martin Luther King Jr. in her class when he was in 5th grade? I mean, really think about it. Do you think Dr. King's teacher knew that there was a kid in that class, 11 years old, who was going to go on to win a Nobel Peace Prize, get a PhD from Boston, graduate from Crozier and Morehouse College, that was going to change the face of America? You think she knew that when she had that 5th grade boy in that class? No. He was just another kid. A preacher's kid at that. You know how preacher's kids are. They said he's probably spoiled, probably a little lazy, talks a little slow. I'd like to go to recess. And yet he grew up to be something we never imagined. And yet, every day in our families, in our households, in our classrooms, in our communities, in our gymnasiums, on our television screens, in our malls, there are literally hundreds and thousands and millions of young people who have the exact same capacity to do and produce great things. That same kid that's in your house right now that you think is crazy because of how he dresses and how she thinks and what kind of music they're listening to, yes, your kids are crazy. All of our children are crazy. That is true. But they also have the ability to do the next big thing, to be the next Ella Baker, to be the next Fannie Lou Hamer, to be the next Harriet Tubman, to be the next Martin King, to be the next Malcolm X. They all have the ability to do that, but we must invest in all of them because we don't know which one is going to be the next big thing. What we know for sure is that we need each and every one of them. Dr. King said, I'd rather have 100 young people than 10,000 Negro preachers. Now, some of that was just about Negro preachers. You can't get a lot done with 10,000 Negro preachers in one room. But it was also about the possibilities that emerge when you listen to young people. The legacy of Dr. King is also one where we don't just listen to young people and old people and people of different political agendas and people of different political affiliations and identity politics and all that stuff. The legacy of Dr. King is also, perhaps most profoundly, about getting America to listen to itself, to getting America to pay attention to its own democratic utterances, to get America to keep track of its own democratic sensibilities, to make sense of its own collective identity and promise. The black freedom struggle in general, from Dr. King backwards and forwards, has always been committed to forcing America not just to usher in new laws and new legislation and new rules and new enforcement of rules, it's also to get America to just listen to itself. That's why you read the great documents of black letters, whether it's the ironic writing of Phyllis Wheatley, "'Twas mercy that brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand," to whether it's David Walker. And if you all are in literature courses or history courses, you should read David Walker's Appeal. Because it's not just a black studies document, it's a quintessentially American document. It's called David Walker's Appeal, a preamble together with 4 articles to the colored citizens of the world, but particularly and most expressly those of the United States. I know it's a long title, but necessarily long. And it begins with a preamble and 4 articles, modeled after what, students? Constitution. Yes, the Constitution. Great students. Why would he model a document calling for freedom after the Constitution? Because he was operating from the signifying tradition of the African diaspora that through indirection and irony and sarcasm and playfulness and the trickster aesthetic was calling on America to do what it promised to do. You got a Constitution. You're promising life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and yet the Negro remains unfree. Read the slave narratives of the life of Gustavus Vassa or Olaudah Equiano. Narrative of the fabulous life of Gustavus Vassa or Olaudah Equiano, written by himself. Important documents that speak to the legacy of King and the possibilities of getting America to listen to itself. First of all, he had to say written by himself. There's something potentially or particularly powerful about slave narratives being written by himself or herself. Speaking to the sort of ironic contradictions of America, which on the one hand says the Negro doesn't have the ability to read, referencing Kant and Hume and the Enlightenment philosophers who said the Negro can't read, and the extraordinary amount of critics like Thomas Jefferson in Notes on Virginia who say the Negro is unable to produce original thought like a Phyllis Wheatley. And that, on the other hand of all that doubt and naysaying about the Negro's ability to read, we have all these laws saying, don't teach Negroes how to read. Well, we can't read, what you worried about? But it's part of a fundamental American contradiction that the Negro, through his letters and through her writing, attempted to get America to pay attention to. You're saying we don't have the ability to read, and yet you're stopping us from reading at all costs. You are telling us that we're lazy, and yet you are making us into human slaves that build the American democratic experiment. You are telling us that we are dirty, and yet we are cleaning people's houses throughout the entire 18th, 19th, and 20th century. You are telling us that we are uncivilized, and yet we raised your children. Listen to yourself. So by the time we get to August 28th, 1963, and Martin King is standing in front of who? Who that? Lincoln. A signifying tradition. He could have stood a lot of places. But he stood in front of Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Dr. King's speech that day is considered one of the greatest pieces of writing of the 20th century. Many people have voted it the most important speech ever produced. The I Have a Dream speech. And we have replicated and reiterated and rearticulated and photocopied and posted and pasted the I Have a Dream speech in every way imaginable. But somehow we have reduced it simply to the dream. I have a dream that one day little black boys and little black girls and little white boys and white girls will sit down together at the table of brotherhood. That becomes the kind of shibboleth of 21st century racial life. Everybody sitting together at a table, looking like a Gap commercial. Benetton ad or something. And while that is a significant component of Dr. King's dream and vision, and we can never understate the importance of racial solidarity and racial unity, the legacy of Dr. King was to get America to listen to all of its promises. In fact, I don't even want to call it a I Have a Dream speech. I prefer to call it a Broken Promises speech. 80 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand signed an Emancipation Proclamation. He referred to it as a great beacon of light. He refers to the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Emancipation Proclamation. Declaration of Independence, Constitution, Emancipation Proclamation. He refers to them as what? Promissory notes. They're like checks. He said, I come to the nation's capital to cash a check. He's talking about promises here. Dreams are great. Promises have budgets attached to them. He said, I come to the nation's capital to cash a check. The Negro has been written these promissory notes, the Emancipation Proclamation, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. They are promissory notes. He said, but the Negro's check has been returned insufficient funds. He says, I refuse to believe the great vaults of democracy could be empty. He says that the Negro lives on a vast island of mass island of poverty amidst an ocean of material wealth and prosperity. Dr. King's point was that America has articulated a promise. The spectacle of the march, the coming together of people, was designed not just to hear the dream that he had, but to get America to listen to its promise. 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, America, you promised. Emancipation Proclamation, America, you promised. Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, America, you tried to promise. Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, America, you promised. Brown v. Board 2, all deliberate speed, 1955, you promised. 1964, public accommodations, America, you promised. 1965, Voting Rights Act, America, you promised. The legacy of King is to get America to not just listen to new stuff and old stuff, but to listen to itself so that we can have a nation that is as good as its promise. But you can't do that. You can't do that. You can't do that. You can't do that without a sense of history. You can't do that without a sense of history. The legacy of Dr. King forces us to wrestle with history in a different kind of way. We talked about reimagining Dr. King not just as a bunch of old civil rights icons, but as young people riding those buses and engaging in those freedom rides and forming the SCLC and forming SNCC, the Organization for African American Unity. But Dr. King also wants us to situate the current moment within the context of history. One of the great challenges of American life is that we live in the great time paradox, to quote Andreas Hussein. The great time paradox says that on the one hand, we love to remember stuff. America and Europe, we love to remember stuff. Asia, Australia, we love to remember stuff. We've built museums and mausoleums. We've built commemorative parks. We've made placemats at McDonald's and Burger King, and we've built more in the last 30 years than we've ever seen. It's literally historically unprecedented how much stuff we've built to remember. We come up with instant nostalgia, TV shows like Best Week Ever. You watch Real Housewives of Atlanta or Real Housewives of New Jersey or basketball, all of them shows with wives, ain't nobody married. And the show will go 18 weeks, and then week 19, the week after the show's over, they start the reunion episode, like, where have you been? A kind of obsession with instant memory, and as Toni Morrison would say, rememory. And that obsession with memorizing and remembering and commemorating and acknowledging is standing in sharp contrast to the simultaneous obsession in the nation for forgetting, for erasing pain, for deleting the most disturbing aspects of our collective experience. The legacy of King is one that calls for us to rummage through history and retrieve those things that sometimes make us uncomfortable, that sometimes hurt. Not for their own sake, but so that we can have a kind of perspective on what's going on now. We love to remember Dr. King as the American hero. When Dr. King died in 1968, speaking out against the war on Vietnam, he was told by the State Department to stay in a Negro preacher's place. Civil rights, cool. Nonviolence, all right. Stop this thing in Vietnam, cool out. Dr. King didn't make People magazine's Most Admired Americans list in his last few years on the planet. Dr. King couldn't get a speaking engagement in most cities in this country. The Dr. King, who was told to stay in a Negro preacher's place, was kicked out of the National Baptist Convention for being a troublemaker. His own alma mater, Morehouse College, wouldn't put Martin Luther King Jr. on the board of trustees. They said he was a bad influence on young people. They said he went to jail too much. Like he was Lindsay Lohan or Chief Keef or something. It's easy now to love the martyr. But the legacy of King forces us to understand that oftentimes the people, and young people remember this, oftentimes when you're standing for freedom and justice, you're standing alone. Oftentimes when you're fighting to change the national character of a collective, you are viewed as the despot, the enemy. You're rejected and hated. Only history can redeem you in that way. We have to remember those things. We have to listen to the stories of our fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers. I listened to my father, born in Wilkes County, Georgia, 1928. His brothers, All of them went off to join the Army. His brothers were in World War II, putting their bodies on the front line. Had to ride back on the last car of the train behind Nazi POWs. My father's high school class took a trip to Washington, D.C., and as they rode through the South, their money was counterfeit. Couldn't buy a hamburger, couldn't eat at a Horn and Hardart, couldn't sleep at a hotel, couldn't have their picture taken in front of the Washington Monument, but dogs could. These memories usher us into a new space of American understanding. But let me be clear, not for the purpose of wallowing in pain and misery, but for the purpose of making sense of the current moment. August 28, 1963 was a special day. That's when King gave the I Have a Dream speech. August 28, 1963. We love to remember that. August 28, 2008, Barack Obama accepts the Democratic Party's nomination for the presidency. 45 years to the day, almost to the hour, that King gave the I Have a Dream speech on August 28, 63, Obama gives the acceptance speech in 08. It's a beautiful moment. It's a kind of mystic connection, a kind of almost spiritual symbiosis that suggests that King's dream was fulfilled in 08 through a matured American body politics, and it feels good. It feels awesome. It's almost like a Disney movie, like something that we could capture and sell and produce and mass produce, because it tells us how far we've come on August 28th. The problem is, if we're going to be a mature nation, if we're going to be a mature intellectual community, then August 28, 1963 and August 28, 2008 cannot superimpose themselves on top of August 28, 2005, when Katrina is at its height. An entire community of people are washed away, rendered disposable, taken from their homes. Numbers written on top of boarded up homes to say how many bodies had died and how many animals had died. Dislocated, relocated, never put back. That's in August 28th as well. August 28th, 2005 has the matter too. And we darn sure can't forget August 28th, 1955, when Emmett Till is murdered. That's a different August 28th, family. Little black boy from Chicago going through Mississippi, attacked, essentially lynched as an act of state-sanctioned violence. Head beaten up 5 times the normal size so that the mother couldn't have an open casket. Now the question is, why is it necessary right now in 2014 to have a conversation about 1955? Well, you learned it last week when Sabrina Fulton stood here and her black boy was beaten and killed and attacked for the vicious crime of being young and black and outside. We got to make the connection, family, because 1955 happens again and again and again. Now, don't get me wrong. The world is a lot better than it was in 1955. I'm not one of those people that refuses to acknowledge progress, and Dr. King would surely say, oh, we've made progress. The progress is extraordinary. But we can't stop here, because the struggles of today are linked to the struggles of yesterday. The dangers of being young and outside in 1955 are not the same as today, but there are dangers that we see right now for young people through juvenile curfews, civil injunctions against gangs, anti-loitering laws, and of course, the now legendary stop, question, and frisk policies. Not that much questioning happens. It's mostly stopping and frisking. As the great philosopher Christopher Wallace said, they sometimes squeeze first, ask questions last. That's how most of these gangsters pass. That's Biggie Smalls for y'all. young people in public space under attack, understood through the lens of history, gives us a window into how to address it now. Right now, public values, public goods, public services that are directed toward racial minorities, toward white vulnerable people, toward gays and lesbians, all these things that are directed toward vulnerable people are under attack. How do you make things that are public under attack? Remember earlier I said sometimes you have to whiten the face of poverty to make it real in 1960. Well, right now in 2014, you can darken the face of poverty to make it irrelevant. When we want to attack the public good and replace it with private interest, the kind of neoliberal fantasy, we do it by rendering the public something that we don't want. And if you want to make the public something you really don't want, what do? You color it in black and brown, so that the public imagination of that which is public is that which is black and brown, so that when people think of public school, they think of what? Black people. Public housing, black people. Public transportation, black. Public options in healthcare, black. Why? How? Well, the point isn't just that they do it, it's that it's counterfactual. When we build homes in the suburbs and give subsidies for it, that's public housing. The public education system that we have here in Utah, that you would see in Iowa or Wisconsin, that's also public. Public assistance, another thing often racially charged or racially marked, is not primarily consumed by black folk. It's consumed by people who need it, of all races, but primarily young white women. What's my point? My point is that we have to have the capacity to situate that even within a public conversation. It's not new. Dr. King always said we have to analyze and dig deeper. Because we were doing this in 1980 with the emergence of the welfare queen. That means that we must listen carefully, we must remember truthfully, but we must also do something else that I think this community in Utah is especially capable of doing, because you've demonstrated the commitment to deep analysis, and that is we must discern wisely. You must ask different questions. We can never rely on simple answers to the complex questions of the day. Now, again, I was telling the students earlier, as somebody who's on cable news, I'm often asked to explain some of the most complex issues of the day in very short amounts of time. They'll be like, Dr. Hill, we want you to explain why people are poor. You have a long segment, 3 minutes, go. There's a kind of obsession with simple answers because they make us feel better. They let us off the hook. But y'all don't want simple answers, right? Y'all don't want simple. Y'all could have went to Utah State for that. Y'all could be at Brigham Young or something. Y'all came here to dig deeper. What does that look like? It means that we must shift our units of analysis and ask a different question. You walk into a public school in parts of Salt Lake City, but more often parts of San Francisco and Oakland and San Jose and Watts and Compton and the 5th Ward in Houston and the 9th Ward in New Orleans and West End Atlanta and in North Philadelphia and parts of Oklahoma, and you walk in all these schools and you see the very similar kinds of practices. You see big metal detectors in the school. You talk about the criminalization of our babies. What does it mean for young people to take a journey to school that takes 20 minutes because as you walk into school, there's a metal detector that you have to go through? And there's a surveillance camera looking at you. We spent more money on surveillance equipment in schools than prisons over the last 5 years. And you walk through the metal detector and you get surveilled by the camera, and then there's a dog sniffing through your legs, and there's a parole officer, probation officer, police officer. They're scanning your body. They're searching your book bag. They're looking through your locker. There's all this technology. There's all this personnel. There's all this infrastructure. There are literally millions of dollars invested in this entire surveillance artifice, and it takes you 20 minutes to get into school, and when you finally get in, ain't nobody stopping you from leaving. Think about it. All of the investment, all of the infrastructure, all of the money is on making it hard to get in, and once you get in, you could do whatever you want and turn around and leave. What kind of public pedagogy, what kind of public notion does that send to the kids about how their bodies matter, about how school matters, about where resources should be directed? And yet, we look at all of that and combine that with a lack of resources, teacher attrition, and then we call the kids dropouts. These same young people, imagine if instead of calling them dropouts, we called them pushouts. Just think about it for a minute. If they were pushouts instead of dropouts, think about how that would shift our unit of analysis, so we're not asking the question, why are they leaving? Instead, we're asking ourselves the tough question, what are we doing to push them out? When a kid bubbles in C instead of B on the test consistently, and they don't do as well on these high-stakes tests, which, by the way, I still don't fully understand. I've never seen a job for a good test taker. I'm not sure how it really prepares you for the world. You know what I'm saying? No extra charge for this, President. But, I mean, when you think about the notion of the test itself, I mean, they say it prepares you for real-world experiences. Oh, y'all got good jobs. Y'all look smart. Y'all got nice clothes on. I mean, when you work in a job, how many jobs have you ever had where they say, Jim, we want you to sit at this desk for an hour by yourself. You can't talk to anybody. You can't work with anybody. You can't research. You can't Google. You can't check. You can't use a calculator. You can't ask a question. You can't write anything down. 60 seconds, go. But that's what we do. And so when the kid then bubbles in B instead of C on the test, consistently, in the midst of all this madness, we say there's an achievement gap. What if instead of calling it an achievement gap, which reifies the gap, we called it a funding gap, an investment gap, a support gap, a mentoring gap, a care gap, a love gap? Now, those gaps force us as grown folk to be accountable for the young people who we have produced and the realities that they're forced to navigate. It lets us off the hook to focus on the gap. You get what I'm saying? A study of the ACLU, and this is the last example I'll give you on this, the ACLU going up and down a New Jersey highway, they did a study that shows that the group most likely to be pulled over are black men between 18 and 25. The group most likely to have guns and drugs in the car are white men between 18 and 25. I don't know, seems odd to me, but the argument that we've made in a kind of reactionary posture is there's a phenomenon. We call it driving while black. We've made movies about it. We've done empirical studies about it. We've made movies like New Jersey Drive. We've talked about what it means to drive while black. What if instead of calling it driving while black, we called it patrolling while racist? Just shifting our units of analysis force us to have a different kind of conversation. Just a thought. To discern wisely is to ask the question about the world as it is and to make sense of the realities as they are without. Let me give you an example. When Dr. King dies in 1968, there are 280,000 people incarcerated. 280,000 people are incarcerated when Dr. King passes away. And we thought it was a crisis. How could a nation incarcerate 280,000 of its own citizens? Fast forward to today. There are currently 2.5 million people in American prisons. Think about this, family. There were about 280,000 people incarcerated 40 years ago, 50 years ago. There are now 2.5 million. If we add parole, probation, if we add juvenile facilities, if we add Abu Ghraib, if we add Guantanamo, we could keep rolling, y'all. We talking about 3-4 million people sitting in American or American-funded prisons. What does it mean for a nation to incarcerate listen to this, 1 out of 100 American citizens? 1 in 100 American citizens is currently under criminal supervision. And just in case you're trying to do the horse race thing, That's more than Canada and France combined. That's more than Ireland and Germany combined. That's more than Sweden and Norway and India combined. And if you think, well, that's the first world, let's go to the axis of evil. Go to North Korea, go to Cuba, Venezuela, go to Iraq, go to Iran, go to Afghanistan. Add them all up, we still have more prisoners. The simple answer, we created a nation of criminals. The children that we raised are criminal. We raised a generation of bad people. We raised a generation of slow runners. People just don't get away from the cops like they used to. We construct simple answers to these complex questions, but we don't ask ourselves, as Dr. King would, what does it mean for us to create a generation of young people in whom we don't place investment and love, but instead we assign containment and blame? What does it mean in 1980 for us to close mental health facilities? From 80 to 88, and take people who were in mental institutions and put them on the street. And then take those people on the street and criminalize being on the street at the state level through anti-loitering, anti-homeless, anti-vagrancy laws, so-called social laws, public drunkenness and panhandling. So now you were up here in a mental institution, now you're down here on the street, and now it's illegal to be on the street. You were up here getting drugs and care, and now you're down here self-medicating. And at the moment that you're on the street self-medicating, they give you what? Crack enters the streets. And at the moment that crack enters the streets, which is cheap, affordable for the person who's homeless and panhandling, we begin what? A war on drugs. We re-intensify our war on drugs, which, by the way, doesn't work because drugs are cheaper, easier to get, and stronger than ever. And we take these people who are on drugs and we incarcerate them and give them exorbitant sentences. There are people literally in American prisons right now who are 18 years old who got 30, 40, 50 years. Obama just pardoned 8 of them, some of whom got 50 years to life or 30 years to life for possession of crack. So now these people are in prisons with mental health issues. They're drug addicted, they're abused, they're marginalized, they're not getting rehab, they're not getting mental health resources. And then when they finally get out of prison, subjected to trauma, they're still drug addicted. They're still homeless. They're still broken. And they can't get public housing because of the drugs. They can't vote in many states because of the drugs. They can't get public education, at least down on the post-secondary level, up through the 80s and 90s because the Stafford loans were inaccessible if you had a drug offense. And black people without drug charges can't get a job. No American can get a job right now. America's unemployment rate is high. Imagine what it is to have a felony drug conviction. So you're essentially consigned to second-class citizenship. But the simple answer is, we create a lot of crime. Poor people, you know how those poor white people are in Montana, they just commit crime. No, poor white people in Montana work hard, they do what they're supposed to do, they make mistakes, but so does Paris Hilton. So does Kanye West. Rich people make mistakes all the time. They just have safety nets. Part of the legacy of Dr. King is to assign equal amounts, not just of love and investment, but also to create equal safety nets so people have the room so you don't have to be perfect to be successful. That's part of the legacy as well, and to not target particular places. Do you know how many, I teach at Columbia University. If I raided Columbia campus tonight, how many people do you think I could arrest for public drunkenness, disorderly conduct, simple possession of marijuana? Like half of them, including the faculty. We have to have a different vision of this. I know y'all ready to go, so I'm going to leave you alone. But there's one more thing I got to say. We must act bravely. The legacy of King, well, really 2 things. We must act brave. We must do something. The legacy of King was not one of simple analysis. Dr. King said we should never become reduced to the paralysis of analysis. We can't think our way out of this, but we must think. Dr. King got the PhD, but he was engaged in mass action. We have analysis and we have action. He wedded the two in ways that perhaps have rarely been done. There's the Du Boises of the world. I mean, there are people who have done it, but it's rare. We must act bravely. After doing all that thinking and remembering and analyzing, we must act bravely. What does acting bravely mean? It means, first of all, we have to actually do something, family. You all are the success stories of education, every single person in this room, even if you don't know it yet. You made it here, or you're on your way here. You're going to be okay. You've been given the most. Now it's time for you to figure out how to move the ball forward, how to pay this thing forward. To act bravely is to make a commitment to action in a world that is so often obsessed with not doing anything. If you forget every single thing I said today, and some of you will, remember this. The biggest problem in the world today is that there are too many people who don't do anything. Really that simple. There are too many people in the world who don't do anything. To act bravely is to stand up and say the world is fixable. I have to act. To act bravely means that sometimes you have to tell the truth when it's difficult. The Prophet Muhammad said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, speak the truth though it may be bitter to others. When you think about the legacy of Jesus overturning tables in the temple where there are money changers, the idea that even in places where you're supposed to be among common visions and common voices and common politics, to act bravely is to speak dangerous truths when there's something at stake. You know how easy it is for me to go on Fox News and argue with people? I think they're all wrong anyway. The challenge is to speak the truth in quarters that are supposed to be safe. To tell the truth when it's difficult. Some of y'all were anti-war when Bush was in office and Obama came in, and somehow y'all act like his Predator drones are better than Bush's. Y'all think that his military interventions in Libya or Iran, or not Iran, thank God, but in Libya or Iraq or Afghanistan are somehow less violent to innocent people. That his corporate bailouts are somehow less of a destructive force to everyday mainstream folk. No, if you're going to be on the side of justice as Dr. King was, you can't be partisan in that way. It means you have to speak the truth even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. That's the legacy. King didn't care about being popular. Speaking out against Vietnam wasn't popular in 1968. Speaking out against militarism wasn't popular in 1968. Speaking out against mass poverty wasn't popular in 1968, yet King made the decision to do so come what may. That's what the great leaders have always done, so I need y'all to go into your communities and speak the truth. The challenge for today is find somebody who's in your political party, who's in your religious tradition, who's in your cultural circle, and find ways to challenge them to be better, to challenge them to be different, to challenge them to reimagine the world. I was in jail visiting. Mr. President was like, oh, it wasn't in the bio. I was with Jesse Jackson, who was here last year. We walked into Cook County Jail on Christmas. How many of you are here for a nonviolent drug offense? Hands go up. How many of you are under 25 years old? Almost every hand goes up. Almost every hand, it's heartbreaking. Almost every hand goes up. These babies, 19, 20, 21, almost all of them there for nonviolent drug offenses. We understand what the war on drugs has done. How many of you finished high school? Almost no hands go up. How many of you have children? Hands go up. 2 kids, hands go up. 3 kids, hands. We stopped asking. There's no doubt that there's a war on drugs. There's no doubt that it ends up affecting small-time drug users and petty drug dealers. There's no doubt that it affects people on poverty. There's no doubt that there's a school-to-prison pipeline that allows the 3rd and 4th grade reading scores of young black boys to be predictors of how many prisons to build 15 years later. All of that is true. We went into the prison and said, who wants to shut this prison down? Who wants to shut it down right now? They said, yeah, what do we do? He said, don't come back no more. Don't come back no more. Now, nobody in here ever suggest, I don't think, that Jesse Jackson doesn't like to talk and think about race. Is that fair to say? I think he thinks and talks about race all the time. He sleeps and dreams about race. But he also understood, as Dr. King did, and as we all must do, that if we're going to act bravely, that means to place a responsibility on ourselves and reject the idea that somehow the progressives talk about the society and the conservatives talk about the self. No, conservatives need to fix the world. They got to be responsible for that. And liberals, y'all got to be responsible for doing individual acts of responsibility too. If there's drugs in your neighborhood, you don't have to sell them. You damn sure don't have to smoke them. If there's old books, you can still read them. If you have children, you still must raise them. We have a responsibility to ourselves that extends beyond the government. That was Dr. King's legacy. Slave masters didn't retire. People got tired and got up and ended it. That's your responsibility. That's my responsibility. So when we leave here today, there are people up the road who are hungry. We can feed them today. There are children right now who in the summertime lose IQ points and literacy points and grade ability because their vocabularies go down. We can go read to them. There are boys in school right now of all races who are exponentially more likely to go to college if one of us from the University of Utah were to stand in that schoolyard. If some of us from the University of Utah will go in that classroom and show them a model of what a college student could look like. There are little girls right now who are less likely to get HIV/AIDS, less likely to drop out, less likely to get pregnant, less likely to become drug addicted if they have a teacher, if they have a mentor, if they have a basketball coach, if they have an arts program, if they have a music program. We know what works. It ain't new. Ain't nothing new but you. We must develop a new commitment to doing what works, to being responsible, to acting bravely. Dr. King was brave. He was stabbed before. It's funny now, everybody loved him, right? All the white people marched with him, all the black people loved him. It's hard to imagine how he got shot being so loved, you know? But at the time, he was stabbed before he was shot, a few years prior. He acted bravely. Nothing's more courageous than nonviolence. He acted bravely. The challenge for all of you today is to say, when I leave this place, I will join an organization. Notice I said join one and not start one. I will join an organization. I will build something. I will work with something. I will sacrifice with something. I will act bravely and participate in the progression of a movement, even, hang with me now, because in the age of selfies and Facebook pages and all that stuff, even if you're not the star of it, even if you don't get the microphone, even if you don't get to be the president or co-president or vice chancellor or whatever title we give ourselves when we make up organizations to be important. It also means that we have to allow women to be at the forefront of these movements. The legacy of Dr. King is also a legacy that emerges out of a tradition, a quintessentially American one, that often puts men in the front and women in the back. A 21st century movement must have women at the forefront of leadership. We can no longer have a woman with a PhD in the back making photocopies while a man is in the front not making no sense. Women must be at the vanguard of this position. Remember, even Dr. King, when he gave the great I Have a Dream speech, he didn't exactly know where he was going. He had lost his oratorical direction. He was kind of meandering and winding. And at the moment, a woman, Mahalia Jackson, yelled from the background, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." And it was at that moment that he gave the greatest speech ever produced in American history. Women have always been there. But it is time for us to imagine a new manhood, a new masculinity, a new understanding of who we are supposed to be that allows women to be what they're already being, leaders. And I know we got to go, but I told you you can't get nothing done with Negro preachers. We must hope relentlessly. Family, we must hope relentlessly. We must hope relentlessly. It's the most beautiful It's the most beautiful part of all of this for me, is that we have something called revolutionary hope. We have to remain prisoners of hope. Now, hope is complicated, right? We see it on T-shirts, you know, hope for change, change for hope, all that stuff. I ain't talking about that. I'm talking about something substantive, something subcutaneous, something deeper than this superficial level of humanity. I'm talking about the kind of belief in the world that says that everything is not okay. We concede that. We begin from the premise that everything is not okay. And this is important because sometimes we think of hope as really being optimism, right? Optimism is everything's going to work out just fine. Everything's going to be okay. Some of you students have that. When y'all take that test y'all didn't study for, you pick it up, you know, you look at it, figure out what class it is. Some of you get religious at that moment. Dear God, please just give me a C. Lord, just give me a C. Can I get a C minus, Lord? I promise I won't party for a week if I just get a C minus. That ain't hope. We call that the 6-year program here at Utah. Some of these students been here so long, President, they got tenure. It's about, hope is about something different, something that forces you to put your hands to the plow. Hope is about the belief that despite the odds, maybe even because of them, if you really get real spiritual with this, that because of the odds, the world can and will be better. That my ability to engage the world, even when it doesn't make it better, actually stops it from becoming worse. And that's important too. The prisoner of hope, the radical vision of hope that I'm talking about in this legacy says that we see the challenges to this nation, we see the threats to our national safety and our national security, we see the holes in the economy, we see the broken nature of the school system, we see all of it, and we don't pretend that it's just going to go away, but we understand that the only thing we can do is fight to change it. To be a prisoner of hope, to have a relentless sense of hope, is to say that no matter how bad the world is, it can get better. For some of you students out there, some of you are in 8th grade and they told you you're a behavior problem. Some of you are out there and they told you that you are a struggling reader even though you're writing raps at home. Some of them told you you don't have any talent yet you singing your songs in your house. Some of them out there told you you don't have a future and you're destined for the state pen or you're destined to be pregnant. But the idea of relentless hope says right now, at this moment, I can be any and everything I want. I don't have to do this. I can be anything. I can be everything. I will do it. The legacy of King is all about that. There was never any evidence that this stuff would end. Howard Thurman said, never ever scale down your dreams to the level of that which is your immediate experience. What I'm talking about, I'm saying you don't have to be prisoner to an event. We as a society don't have to be prisoner to a moment. We don't have to be prisoner to a statistic. We don't have to be prisoner to a condition. We don't have to be prisoner to an ideal. We can break the shell and be any and everything that we want to be because that's all we've ever done. We don't have to be the prisoner. We can release the prisoner because that's what we've always done in this society. There was no evidence that slavery would end. There was no evidence that Jim and Jane Crow would end. There was no evidence that the segregated lunch counters would get integrated. There was no evidence that a skinny state senator from Chicago would become the nation's first black president. But it all happened. There was no evidence 25 years ago that Prince would be the normal one and Michael Jackson would be the weird one. Ain't nobody see that coming. I mean, Prince may have. Michael definitely did not. But family, relentless hope says 10 words. I do not have to be what I once was. I do not have to be what I once was. We do not have to be what we are now. No matter what our national character is, we can change it. Some of you students out there, been told you don't matter, but today you can realize you do. Some of you are C- students, and you can be an A student tomorrow. Some of you have been told you're disengaged. You can become engaged. Some of you have terrible experiences, and some of you have been in 50 houses, still haven't found a home yet. And despite all of that, you can be different and better tomorrow. And as a collective, we can do the same thing. We can follow the tradition of Dr. King and see young people who are rendered disposable and imagine them as different. We can see immigrants who are seen as illegals and see them instead as investments. We can see a nation that has been divided by race and bring it back together and heal, so that when they say it's impossible, we'll say it's inevitable. And when they say it can't happen, we'll say it must happen. When they say it won't happen, we say it will happen. When they see us fragmented, we'll see us together. When they see us destroyed, we'll see us enhanced. When they see you as an immigrant, we'll see you as a leader. When they see you going to the state pen, we'll see you going to Penn State. When they see a Negro on a plantation, we can imagine a king raised among all of us to change, move, and inspire. Thank you all so much. God bless you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I believe I went over my time, but we have time for a few questions and answers before we move forward. And I understand if some of you have to leave, I won't be offended. I know you have things to do. But again, thank you. Thank you so much. We'll take a minute. I think there are microphones on these sides. People are coming up. Feel free to ask questions. Thank you.
Hello? Kind of. All right. Dr. Hill, first of all, thanks for writing the article on C.C. McDonald. That was really moving and powerful stuff. If you haven't read it, you should Google it. This has all been about Dr. King, which is very moving stuff. I'm curious about how you feel about the kind of divergent legacies of, Malcolm X and Dr. King. Personally, I feel like Dr. King has been kind of neutered historically to kind of take away his edge, to make him more cuddly and kumbaya, to not scare people, when he was, pretty serious and an aggressive guy. So I'm just wondering if you see any kind of pattern or moral or lesson in the divergent legacies historically of those two figures.
And I think it's important that you say divergent legacies, because legacy speaks as much to collective memory and representation as it does to actual historical action, right? There's often a commitment with black leadership to dividing. So you see Booker T and Du Bois, right? What's fascinating is if you read David Levering Lewis's, you all should read these books. Read David Levering Lewis's extraordinary 2-volume biography of Du Bois. And in the first volume, in like the 16th chapter, he talks about Du Bois and the way in which Du Bois was actually funded by Booker T. Washington. And in fact, when Du Bois was looking for a job in the South, one of the people who tried to bring him in to be the superintendent of the school district was Booker T. So while we sort of constructed as Booker T versus Du Bois, higher education versus drop your buckets where they are, there was much more commonality than we want to imagine. Look at the movie Ali versus Frazier. They duking it out, but then Ali gets in Frazier's car and they talking, and he asks him if he needs any money. There's a way in which we frame people as bitter enemies when in fact they are not. So when we get to King and Malcolm, don't get me wrong, there was some acrimony there, and there were some bitter words tossed back and forth, mostly from Malcolm to King at a particular moment in Malcolm's trajectory, but I think it is important for us to remember them both as they were. That means that, one, Malcolm was on a fascinating journey toward understanding the global nature of white supremacy, understanding the interrelationship between, as King was, racism, poverty, and militarism. So when King dies, he's going before the United Nations to bring a case about the United States that wasn't just about white people. It was about a kind of structural commitment to racial inequality and also economic inequality. So Malcolm was growing and developing, and that was his legacy. And to the extent that we always think of Malcolm in the window with a gun saying, by any means necessary, Malcolm never shot anybody. Malcolm never hit anybody. Malcolm was advocating self-defense, which is a fairly, if anything, the radical position was Dr. King saying if somebody punches you in the face, let them punch you in the face. It is a fairly ordinary, intuitive response to say if somebody punches you in the face to punch them back. Whether we agree with that or not, we can have a debate about that. I agree with that, but we could debate about that. But nevertheless, I'd agree with hitting them back, to be clear. But Malcolm is sometimes framed outside the arc of sort of normalcy, when in fact, I would argue, in some ways, it's quite the opposite. That said, King's legacy also is far more radical, to your point, than we've also understood it to be. When Martin Luther King dies, he has a speech in his pocket. His last sermon that he was going to give before he died was in his pocket. And you know what it was called? Why America Might Be Going to Hell. That ain't the King we put on the placemat at Burger King. King had a radical skepticism of the ability of America to recover and heal. It wasn't a kind of ontological claim about the capacity of white people or the capacity of black people or the kind of existential possibility of America being different. He was saying, in a kind of realpolitik kind of way, I don't know if America's going to change. Malcolm was in that place. If anything, they were coming together more than apart, but even at their moments of divergence, it wasn't nearly as wild and radical as people suggest. So I think that's why it's so important for us to read the primary works of these people. Read Letter from a Birmingham Jail. Read the I Have a Dream speech. Again, all of it, though. Read the Mountaintop speech, but then dig deeper. Read the 18-page speech that King gave on W.E.B. Du Bois in 1963 in August. Remember, Du Bois dies August 27th, 1963, the night before the March on Washington. So read about that. Read Malcolm's primary work. Read this great new biography, even though I disagree with half of it, by Manning Marable on Malcolm X, right? So read all these works, read all these understandings, and then you realize that the radical tradition runs through King as well. It's a different radical tradition. It's one that still believes in redemptive suffering. It's one that believes in revolutionary Christianity, but it's still a radical tradition. And oftentimes, nothing has been more radical than the church in America. Early Sunday school literature was probably the most radical piece of literature you could see. David Walker's Appeal was hidden behind Sunday school books, right along with the writings about Nat Turner. So the church has never been a site of passivity, or at least, well, it wasn't a site of passivity. But I'll stop there because I know we got to keep moving. And I'll answer all these. Everybody who's standing up, I promise I'll answer, and I'll be quick. Suitably brief, rather. Yeah.
First of all, hello? First of
These,
all,
you all are at the elementary school right back there, right? Or the high school? My bad. Give these young people a round of applause for coming. They have to get back to school, but give them a round of applause. Thank you for coming. Yes, next question.
yes, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge you're very inspiring with your speaking of Martin Luther King.
Thank you, brother.
And we forgot one individual in regards to Martin Luther King. That would be Coretta Scott King. How inspirational she was and how well she endured.
Absolutely, and thank you for saying that. I think, again, there is a habit, and I clearly am complicit in this today, of forgetting the women who often pushed them forward. Again, whether it was Ella Baker, whether it was Fannie Lou Hamer, forcing, Mississippi to be seated, the delegation to be seated, or whether it's Coretta Scott King, who not only had to endure the loss of a husband, but who stood side by side on the pathway to civil rights, and who also, after King passes away, continues to be a drum major for justice all the way into her death in 2006. I mean, if you think about it, no one of the civil rights tradition fought harder for LGBT rights than Coretta Scott King. Of that tradition. Certainly there are other people who fought, but I'm talking about in that tradition. You know, we see the same thing with Winnie Mandela. The great Madiba passed away a month ago, 2 months ago now, in South Africa, a month ago. And we often forget that during those 27 years that Nelson Mandela was incarcerated, it was Winnie Mandela who kept the legacy moving, who engaged in protracted struggle, who kept the ANC alive, who kept the radical spirit moving. So we have to applaud Coretta Scott King. We have to applaud Betty Shabazz. We have to applaud Coretta Scott King, Winnie Mandela, Nelson, all those people. Thank you. My brain is moving slow. Thank you. I think we have 2 more questions, yes.
Well, actually, in the interest of time, where the question section is actually over.
Who had a question?
I do. Can I just one?
Yeah, let her ask it. She's been standing and waiting
Okay,
politely.
go. Okay.
Here's what I'll do. I know we have to go. Give me 3 minutes, and how many, you two had questions, right? I can't do all y'all now, don't trip. So you two and you, and give you each of you, I'll answer each question in less than a minute, I promise.
All right.
But you have to ask the question, no
right.
comments, just
all right.
questions.
Okay. So I came here because you're a hip-hop activist, and hip-hop saved my life personally. Nas said it himself, hip-hop is dead, and when it dies, we all die together. So what is your advice on, like, sorry, my voice is shaky because I'm, like, really nervous.
No, it's okay, it's okay.
So what is your advice to keep, like, that hip-hop movement going back to, like, Rakim, Tupac? I know we got, like, Ab-Soul and,
Yeah.
you know,
My response would be, hip-hop's not dead. Hip-hop will never be dead. There's nothing more quintessentially hip-hop than to say hip-hop is dead, right?
Yeah.
Because that inspires a kind of response. In the new generation, it's like, it's Kendrick with Control, right?
Yeah.
Going after everybody, right?
Yeah.
I'm a Muslim on Polk. I'm Machiavelli Revisited. I'm a king of New York, right?
Yeah.
West Coast dude moving up to New York saying that he's the king of New York. It inspires a kind of response. That's what made Richard Sherman so dope to me after he whooped the 49ers the other day. It's a kind of hip-hop kind of interview.
You repping it for the hood.
Exactly.
That's right.
And it's a response. It's a call to hip-hop is a battle-based tradition. It's a competitive tradition. So in hip-hop, we might, in the blues tradition, it might be going over singing a standard, right? I might sing What a Man, you might sing What a Man. I might do, hey, mister, your wife is cheating on us. You might do whatever, you know. So there might be these really interesting, complicated, signifying songs. In hip-hop, we might spit over the same beat. So we don't sing the same song, but we spit over the same beat. So I might spit over Control, 2 years ago, Exhibit C, or 5 years ago, a Millie, or before that, the classic is still Paid in Full. And so we will all rap over the same beat to see who is better, and it's a kind of competitive tradition. When Nas says hip-hop is dead, you had all ththese people, who, including KRS-One, old school, who with Marley Marl made Hip-Hop Lives. So hip-hop will live as long as the competitive tradition is there, as long as the spirit is there. Remember, hip-hop is never reduced to the MC. Breaking never stopped. B-boying, again, never stopped, right? Graph writing never stopped. So DJing, mixing never stopped. Turntablism never stopped. Hip-hop music, hip-hop fashion, hip-hop language, hip-hop books, hip-hop literature, that stuff never stopped. Hip-hop ain't going nowhere as long as people like you keep it alive. This brother right here and this brother right here had quick questions.
Do you think understanding privilege and understanding our own privilege is fundamental to understanding and making social change?
Absolutely. You cannot understand. I keep going back to Du Bois because we have to think about, because he gave us a language for this in 1935 when he made Black Reconstruction. But in the first 3 chapters of Black Reconstruction, chapter 1 is about the slave, chapter 2 is about the planter, and chapter 3 is about the white worker, just to give one example. And the question was, why would, in chapter 3 he asked the question, why would a white worker side with the bosses and not with the slave, right? In other words, if I am a white worker and slavery exists, I should want to end slavery just as much as the slave. Because if I'm a white worker and slavery exists, I'm never going to get a job because there's a slave there. And the prices are real good on that. So they should want to end slavery too, but he said, why is it that they side with the managerial class, the planter? He said it's because they get a kind of psychic investment in whiteness. He called it the psychic wages of whiteness. Chris Rock talked about it, right? He said there's a one-legged janitor that won't trade places with me right now, and I'm rich, right? There's a way in which we are invested in a certain notion of whiteness, and we close ranks around that at the expense of collective growth. That's why people named Bubba in Mississippi will vote against their economic interests. Men, we often close ranks around male privilege. That's why we often stay silent in the face of sexism. Because even though ultimately it destroys our psyche, it makes us unhealthy, it's a kind of degenerative social disease, we will rely on patriarchy, misogyny, and sexism and close ranks around maleness at the expense of female bodies because we enjoy the privilege of being male, of never having to think about this. I was looking for Byron, he just walked out, but I was looking for a hairbrush yesterday. You know how hard it is for a black dude to find a hairbrush in Utah? You know what I mean? But it's something you don't have to think about. If you walk into a store and there's a flesh-colored Band-Aid and you're white, there's a kind of understanding that when they say flesh-colored, they really mean you. They don't mean me. My flesh color ain't peach. So, and neither is really yours. You get my point, though. It gives us a notion of what's normal. And when you don't think about the ways in which your own experience is normalized at the expense of other people, those of us who identify as straight have to think about the way in which our collective experience is normalized against those of queer bodies, those of bisexual and gay and transgender bodies. We normalize one set of experiences at the expense of others, and as a result, we all collectively suffer. Last question.
I think that you made an excellent point saying that hip-hop isn't dead and, there are people like Kendrick keeping it alive. I was just wondering, do you think that the current trend of hip-hop can have the same positive social impact now that it's going down the path of rappers like, Rick Ross or 2 Chainz as opposed to Public Enemy and NWA?
I would say let's not romanticize any of that, right? Because at the moment where there's Public Enemy, there was also NWA. And F the Police coming straight from the underground, to me, was perhaps the most radical articulation of resistance politics. That's what Huey Newton talked about. That's what Marx talked about with the lumpen proletariat. There's a way in which the radical street hip-hop in some ways is more revolutionary than PE. Sometimes we romanticize groups like De La Soul and Tribe Called Quest as revolutionary groups or as political groups. They were culturally nationalist. The aesthetics look good, and cultural nationalism is important. In fact, from the 60s, it's kind of all we have left is like Kwanzaa, right, as opposed to like the Black Panthers. But the point is, there's a kind of way in which we romanticize a moment and think we had this great hip-hop that got kicked off by NWA, or we have this great hip-hop that's getting kicked off by Rick Ross. Yeah, Rick Ross is problematic for all sorts of reasons, not the least of which is that he is, in fact, a former correctional officer who says that he's the biggest boss you've seen thus far, right? That is on its face problematic, right? But the more problematic part about the moment is that we're not identifying that there are other groups. To me, hip-hop is most exciting right now because it got back to music. You look at the BET Hip-Hop Awards, you see ciphers again. You got Kendrick, you got Ab Soul, you got J-Rock, you got, even if you like, I'm not a big Wale fan, but you got Wale, you got Cole, even Drake, who I don't like very much, like, they can all rap. You know what I mean? Can Jeezy rap? Not to me. Can 2 Chainz rap? No, but I rock with both of them. I'll turn up to both of them. Meek Mill, Dreams of Nightmare, 2 in the morning, I'm with you. You get what I'm saying? So I can appreciate that everybody's not going to be revolutionary, but everybody's not going to be radical, because at no moment has every artist been radical. At no moment has every artist been about the struggles. It's okay. We just need a small group of people who are willing to do the work, who are willing to make revolutionary art. And honestly, I want a political movement about social change, and I don't need rap to be the lead of that. I need somebody to be the lead of that, but it doesn't have to be rap. And lastly, y'all have the opportunity now to consume as much music as you want. You don't need a major label. You can go on YouTube, you can go on Instagram, you can find all these independent labels and consume what you want. If you like a certain kind of music, buy it, support it, invest in it. And you don't have to buy Rick Ross. That's all. That's the takeaway from today. You don't have to buy Rick Ross. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Hill once again, and we're going to leave him with a beautiful picture book of the mountains and the deserts of Utah. So you'll come back again.
Thank you
so much.
so much. Thank you so much.
Oh, terrific. Thank you.